Okay, well, we're here with David Church, author of the Edison Trilogy. The third book, David, is being published in April. This is a work of historical fiction, but there's quite a bit of history in here, some surprising history in which the plots of all three books kind of turn. So maybe you could talk about the one in the current book.
Well, the one, as I researched these books, history kind of jumped out at me at times. And, in the first book, it was the fact that Edison actually did try for decades to invent a machine that would communicate with the dead. In the second book, it was the fact that in Roosevelt's first term, his first year as president, a cabal of business interests formed a plot to neuter him completely and failed, thankfully. And in this book, it had to do with the fact that in 1941, Rudolf Hess, who was the deputy Fuhrer to Adolf Hitler, stole a plane, flew to Scotland to meet with a duke who he had met many years ago at I think the 1936 Olympic Games in Germany, to basically try to find a way to stop the war. Now, I've never read any of these things in conventional history books. So when something like that those things jump out at you that are so unique and so undiscussed, that's a stepping off point.
Yes, yes, and the Rudolph Hess is an amazing episode. There's still a lot of questions about it too. To this day, where historians debate what his real motive was.
I mean, the premise was he was trying to go and find some sort of way to bring a peace of some kind, but who knows? He was basically shut off into a prison, and he stayed there until the day he died.
Yes, and he lived for long after the war,
Yes,
and this
yes.
secret sort of died with him. Yeah, I think it's very interesting what his motives were, whether Hitler actually knew, because that was part of it. How Churchill reacted. There was pressure on him, and I think you talk a little bit about this in the book. There was some pressure to kind of listen to him, to listen to Hess. Maybe he's got a real offer, but I think Churchill said no.
I think that what conveniently happened for both England and the Allies and Germany was after 72 hours of trying to figure out what to do, they mutually declared he was insane. And they shut him up at the Tower of London. And then after the Nuremberg trials, I believe he went to Spandau prison and was perhaps the last prisoner in that facility.
Yes. And I think in your book, you paint him as a more sympathetic character.
Yes. He certainly was Hitler's, henchman. But he also came to a point in his life when he saw what was happening in Germany and how it was affecting the world. He realized if there was going to be any world for his children and his children's children, he had to act.
Let's flip over to the other side of the Atlantic. I think one of the interesting things about the third book is that you open it far from the turmoil of Europe at war, and in this sort of sleepy town in Pennsylvania, Doylestown. I've heard of it. How did you choose that?
For many years when I would read books about World War II, Doylestown seemed to be a civics lesson in action, because it was a farming community. You had, blue collar workers, but you also had denizens of Broadway and the arts who had homes there. Oscar Hammerstein II had just written Oklahoma, and he had a home there with his family. S.J. Perlman, Dorothy Parker. It just was this odd confluence of people who all got along. It really was a little atoll of sanity in a terrible time.
Interesting. Sounds like there's a book to be written about Doylestown during World War II.
You first.
So let's now hurdle ourselves back over the Atlantic again, which is where our hero John is taken in the book. First of all, I think a fundamental question. Did you kind of take a deep breath as a writer before you decided to try and write Hitler? Were you eager to do that, or did you have to kind of give some pause before you started writing about Hitler?
Because he played a minor role in the first book, I knew there was an arc for that character and that he could play effectively through the three books. But yes, I did. It was very daunting. because when you deal with someone like Hitler, you're dealing with one of the big guns. And I mean, even today, as you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm for Mr. Hitler from certain corners. But it is one of those things where his character has been visited so many times. You want to make sure that you're bringing something to it that resonates with a reader that they might not have discovered before. And that was daunting, and that was a goal. And I'm happy to say I think I've actually achieved it. You know, John Dawkins is the hero of this piece. His wife, Sophie, is a former reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, and they have a 10-year-old boy, Josh, and they are all catapulted into intrigue and danger in this book. Now, Sophie is in particular danger because she is trapped with Hitler in the Führer bunker, and she has to use her wits and her charm and her cunning to keep herself alive and to write the story and to get at the essence of who he is. And she reaches that at the very end, where she realizes who he is and what he has in common with other dictators. Throughout history, no matter their age, race, or geopolitical background, dictators had one key characteristic in common. At heart, they were 6-year-old boys, traumatized into a state of arrested development during childhood, which left them with no capacity for reason, consequence, or shame. Their only goal was to stuff their insatiable selves with as many wants as possible, fulfilled at their pleasure, in pursuit of a happiness that would never be achieved, for no bottom existed to satisfy their ravenous need for more. So the avaricious cycle continued, more wantonly and heedlessly than before. The only way to arrest this madness was to engage Hitler head on. He wasn't just a global warlord. He was a spoiled brat, and it was time for a spanking. And John, everything old is new again.
Yes, I could think of a couple of people in the news right now who sort of fit that description. Let's go back to the dictator himself, to Hitler. I did not know that he had this real interest in the occult.
Yeah, he did. He was obsessed with it. And this occurred, I believe, after, I want to say in 1934. He had assumed the mantle of leader of his country, I believe chancellor at the time. And he brought into his sphere anyone who claimed to be a wizard, a warlock, a witch, a psychic, an astrologer, a numerologist. And he put them all on retainer. And then one day, they all disappeared. They just disappeared. And we know this because Aleister Crowley, who was an English wizard, who was known as the wickedest man in the world, was involved with Hitler and on retainer. And he was one of the few people, as he said at one point, I'm not a psychic, but I knew when to get out.
Huh.
And he got out.
Interesting. I forgot that Crowley was actually in that circle too.
Yes.
Although
yes.
he didn't turn out to be a fan of Hitler's, though.
No, not at all.
No. Interesting. That, I mean, to me, that's something I think a lot of readers will find interesting. And another real character, and we should point out that he is the third of 3 real characters from the world of arts and entertainment who populate your books. And the third one in this book is Noel Coward, who I had heard of, but until I read your book, I had never listened to a lot of his music. And now I'm a big fan. He's brilliant. He's so funny. But you also depict him as an agent for what is now, I think, MI6, but what was the British spy service during World War II. Is that true?
Yes, it is. Coward talks about the fact that during World War I, he said, I was the most hapless soldier in the history of the British Empire. And then when World War II came along, he was probably one of the most successful, well-known performers in the world, and certainly in England. he was given a job in PR in Paris. It didn't work out well, and he thought maybe his chance to really contribute something of integrity to his country had gone by, and it had not. He was approached by Little Bill Stevenson, who was a friend of his, who was a head of MI6, as well as Ian Fleming, who was a friend of his. Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books. And they basically said, we want you to go undercover as yourself, or as the uber version of who you are, which is the flippant, theatrical playboy with not a thought in his head. And that's what he did. And he would go from party to opening night to closing night, and he listened to everyone. And they told him things they would never tell anyone else. He was invaluable to the war effort.
That is fascinating. And he is just a delightful character in the book. The third of three, there's been one you've placed in each novel. Maybe you want to talk about the first two, because they were quite memorable also in real life and in your depiction of them.
Well, when I was plotting out who are my characters, what year does this take place, et cetera, I sort of went to the old maxim of Jack Warner. Now, Jack was the head of Warner Brothers, and he had a formula for a successful film. You need to have brains, you need to have brawn, you need to have beauty, and you need a best friend. And so with brains, of course, I have Mr. Edison. With brawn, I had John, who's his assistant. With beauty, I had Emily, the Ziegfeld showgirl that John is in love with. And for best friend in the first book, I discovered that George Gershwin started his career as a teenage accompanist for the Follies. And so it made perfect sense to bring in a composer I revere to look at him as a young man and how his exploits in this book shaped him as a composer of tremendous joy and depth. In book two, it's 1933. It's a little bit more of a screwball comedy tone. And I thought, who do I love from that period? Who would I want to spend time with? Groucho Marx. And it worked out beautifully, because at that point in his career, their films were tanking at the box office. Groucho thought his creative life was over when it was really just beginning. And so he's a wonderful companion to have. And then in this book, Noel Coward, who I've also admired tremendously, and who actually historically played a key role within the success of the Allies in World War II.
Yeah, that is fascinating. And I should add, and I know we're jumping around a little bit on the books, but I have to mention that the Groucho character, of course, another daunting person to write, because you were basically writing lines for Groucho Marx. And I will say they are very funny. You did a great job. But what I particularly liked about Groucho in book two was his unlikely friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt. And if that sounds crazy to any viewers of this, I urge them to read book two, because it's a marvelous friendship that you have largely created. Did they actually meet?
I'm sure they met at some point in a social setting, but really, when you have Groucho Marx, you need a straight woman. And is there any better straight woman than Eleanor Roosevelt? So.
Book three takes a much darker turn later in the book. And part of it is because a large part of the setting of the book is Hitler's bunker. As you mentioned earlier, Sophie's in there with him. Talk a little bit about that. And particularly, speaking of best friends, can you tell me how Hitler dispatched his best friend in the bunker?
Yeah, again, history is stranger than fiction. As I was reading this, the bunker was first of all, there's a great film called Downfall. It's a German film. It came out in, I think, 2004. Bruno Ganz plays Hitler. If you haven't seen it, see it. It is superb. And I watched it several times just to get a sense of the environment, which was at times terrifying in the bunker. But there are things that come out from history that are fairly astonishing, and you go, that can't be real, and it is. There was a period towards the end when the Russians were getting much closer to the Reich Chancellery, and his staff came to Hitler, and they were terrified. and weeping, and they did not want to die, and they did not want to be enslaved. And he was very kindly to them, and he was very almost paternal with them, and told them that what they needed to do was to take charge of their own life and their own death. And he suggested that they poison themselves. And they, of course, blanched, and then he thought, well, maybe an object lesson is necessary. And he had a dog, Blondie, who was his beloved pet of many years, and basically poisoned his dog in front of them. And and then, of course, they all dismissed, because how do you top that? But you know, it's indicative again of that character, that he thought he was doing the right thing. And Sophie mentions to him, terrific, you just killed your best friend. Well, scratch that, make that only friend. And it's true.
Yeah, that was an absolutely chilling scene. You know, as we've sort of skimmed through some of the memorable characters, many real and a few imagined, in the trilogy, we really haven't talked about the namesake much. So Thomas Edison, by this point, astute viewers or readers of your book know that Thomas Edison was no longer alive by the time of World War II. He plays a role, but we'll let the reader discover what that role is.
Right.
But as you look back now, I mean, Edison was the main character in the first book, an interesting character in the second, and a presence in the third. What have you learned about him, and what, now that you've kind of lived with him in a manner of speaking over several years, what do you have to tell us about Thomas Edison?
Well, you know, for my purposes, I've done a ton of research on Edison, and I'm not a biographer. That's not my gig, but I learned a tremendous amount about him. And for my purposes in these books, I've made him more of a combination of Merlin and Professor Marvel. Okay? But there was that aspect to him. But there were also the aspects of purpose and discipline and doggedness. And even though he was happy to receive money and wanted to receive money for his inventions, he used that money to create more inventions. And he's certainly an iconic figure, but he was also, I think, at heart, a genuinely decent human being. And it says a lot for the fact that the men who were friends of his, such as Mark Twain, recognized that quality in him and valued it.
So now we're at the end of it. Is there any more that you have to say, or any more in your imagination about Thomas Edison that you think you might want to write?
I got to tell you, at this point, I think this is it. I think I've gone as far as I can. But I will tell you, it has been creatively, it's been the pleasure of my life. It's, as you know, whenever you work historically, you just want to make sure you've got things right as best you can, and ground the fiction in real history. But I feel as if the arc for Edison in this, in trying to save the world, and then realizing in book 3, it's not the world he's come back to save. It's basically John, his son, his intellectual son. And so I think that story is done. But I never say never, so you never know. But at this point, I feel as if the story is complete, and it's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. And so I hope readers, if they haven't read the first 2, they will. If they have, Thomas Edison and the Magi Solution, book 3, and the conclusion of the Edison Trilogy will be out in April. And I urge everybody to get a copy of this and to meet all these fascinating historical and some fictional characters in ways that you will find very surprising and delightful.
Hey, listen, if somebody picks up this book and they enjoy it half as much reading as I did writing, I'm very satisfied.
That's great. Well, thank you, David.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Appreciate the time.